Hello, this is Dominic Boyer from Rice University, currently riding out my quarantine at the American Academy in Berlin. And I just want to thank the organizers of the event, especially Bethany Wiggin. I know how frustrating it must have been to put so much time and effort into designing and organizing this amazing conference, only like so many other dreams to be lost to pandemic conditions, but still the opportunity to talk about climate data and climate sensing, about public communication surrounding climate data is just too good to pass up, and I'm so glad we have this virtual opportunity. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my work on flooding and flood recovery in Houston. Just as a quick background, I have been working on issues of energy transition and climate change, climate impact in my work as an anthropologist for a little over 10 years. But it was really the personal experience of living through Hurricane Harvey in Houston in 2017 that brought me to floods and flood aftermaths as a research topic. So I want to tell you a little bit about that project, what some of the findings were, walking through the data a little bit so you have a sense of some of what is all involved in the project, and then maybe thinking a little bit about where it could go from here. So Houston floods is something of a civic mantra. It's something you hear Houstonians say all the time. It's kind of a kind of everyday fatalism that Houstonians hold close to their heart. And of course, it's no wonder. You know Hurricane Harvey very well. You may have heard a little bit less about Tropical Storm Imelda, and yet in some parts of Houston, the impact was just as devastating this past year. Tropical Storm Allison was the storm we always heard about as the most devastating storm when we moved to Houston in 2008. But Allison, was dwarfed by the impact of Harvey, to be sure. What was striking, though, was that Harvey was not a singular event in the experience of many Houstonians. It was the third so-called 500-year flood event within a 24-month period between 2015 and 2017. The other two being the Memorial Day floods of 2015 and the Tax Day floods of 2016. So by the time Harvey came around, it was beginning to feel a little bit as though this was a new normal. And this project, I'll be talking a lot about watersheds and floodplains, and I just wanted to visualize that for you here briefly. Houston has, or rather Harris County, where Houston sits, has 22 different Bayou watersheds, and about 22% of Harris County exists in the 100-year floodplain of those watersheds. Now that's out of date, actually. We found that there was something tricky going on because 75% of the structures that flooded during Hurricane Harvey lay outside the FEMA 100-year floodplain. And indeed, with the NOAA 14 flood atlas data, it has not been entirely reconciled with topology to produce the new floodplain maps. Those are supposed to be coming in 2021. But the kind of rough thumbnail estimates that hydrologists have explained to me means that the 100-year floodplain is now actually more like a 25-year floodplain. And indeed, every year, every time they've recalculated the floodplain since 1983, when it was first done for Harris County, there has been a greater increase of rainfall. So it's always been going up, and at least over the past 40 years or so. So I mentioned that this was the third 500-year rainfall event, and that was the structuring of the grant really focused on this idea of repetitive catastrophic flooding, not simply on the impact of the singular event of Hurricane Harvey. And we wanted to focus on more than one bayou. Here you see the density of the bayous and also the number of flooded homes. And there are three kind of major bayous: the Buffalo Bayou, the Brays Bayou, and the Greens Bayou. The Buffalo Bayou is the one that runs through the center of town, and it's also the one that the Houston Ship Channel sits on. That bayou, as I'll talk about in a few minutes, was actually adequately defended to some extent with massive reservoir projects in the 1940s. So it's the only really one of the 22 watersheds that has something like adequate flood defense. Today, the Brays and the Greens are heavily settled but inadequately defended against flooding. So we thought we would focus on these two, relatively dense and highly flood impacted bayous. This was the kind of brief, if you will, on the NSF Rapid grant that we received. And when I say we, I mean myself and Dr. Mark Vardy, who is my collaborator in this research, who's currently affiliated with the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. There's a lot here. You can pause if you want to read through it. I'll just talk over it a little bit. Basically, our sense was that of the disaster research that's been preeminent in our field of anthropology, for the most part, there's been more interest in the kind of technopolitics of disaster anticipation and mitigation, risk mitigation specifically, and less interest in the affective, emotional dimensions of flood recovery. That's not to say one is better than the other, just I think there was an opportunity there to do some new work, especially in this place, Houston, which had seen, again, not just one disaster, but three. In certain parts of Houston had flooded heavily 3 times within 24 months. And so it gave us a way to talk about a kind of catastrophe that we were calling slow catastrophe, taking a page from Rob Nixon's work on slow violence. Obviously, Hurricane Harvey was a spectacular, catastrophic event, but the other 2 500-year flood events were just normal Gulf of Mexico storm fronts. And so this idea that this kind of catastrophe could become part of normal rainfall and the experience of normal kind of everyday life was something we were interested in. Also, from Nixon's work, this idea that the impacts are not felt evenly, that different parts of the city will experience these catastrophes in different ways, especially the negative impacts to marginalized populations that aren't seeing the kinds of governmental assistance and attention that some of the wealthier areas of Houston have been. That said, of course, Harvey impacted the entire city, as you saw in the previous slide, so it wasn't as though there was any neighborhood in particular that was spared. The other aspect theoretically that we were interested in was this really interesting work that connects infrastructures to emergent forms of social and political subjectivity. We were interested in exploring Nikhil Anand's, a wonderful colleague from Penn, his concept of hydraulic citizenship that he developed in his remarkable work on water supply, drinking water supply and management in Mumbai. Obviously, the issue in Houston is not having too little drinking water, it's having too much flood water, but still we thought this idea of hydraulic citizenship, of a political awareness, a sense of political belonging tied to infrastructure, tied to the diluvial experience of chronic flooding would be something worth exploring. So those were the kind of the theoretical aims of the research. But in reality, we got into, really deep, in-depth sorts of conversations with people about their emotional response to this chronic flooding, and then also how they were making decisions about whether to rebuild their homes, to tear them down, to sort of sell at lot value and flee. And so it really covered a gamut of different kinds of responses from people who believed that they could master the flooding through their own kinds of infrastructural projects, personal infrastructural projects, and those who felt like there was no future and had to go. We did 2 case studies of 2 neighborhoods, and this is the map here is a kind of heat map of chronic flooding before Harvey in Houston, and you see that the certain darker areas are places that had flooded multiple times since the year 2000. 2 of them we focused on in the study, Greens Point, which is on the Greens Bayou, a predominantly Hispanic and African American renter-occupied neighborhood of Houston, and then Meyerland, which is in the southwestern part of the city, reclaimed rice fields, one of the first cul-de-sac suburban neighborhoods, historical center of Jewish life in Houston. These are areas that share flood vulnerability, but otherwise are quite different. Meyerland also a pretty well-educated, well-resourced area, mostly owner-occupied single-family homes. So we did, in 2018 and 2019, the research team, which was Mark and I and 2 undergraduates, Jolyn Martinez and Alice Liu from Rice University, completed close to 90 interviews, as well as a survey, which came at the end of the research to kind of expand the range of subject participants, in the study, and to get opinions really focused again upon the emotional responses to the flooding, as well as the epistemic processes behind how people were making decisions about whether to stay or go. That was interview. There was participant observational research at community meetings, some volunteer work on flood recovery ourselves, and some expert interviews to round it out. So we learned this term very early on in the research, flooding. It's a complicated identification, but people preferred it to flood victim in Houston. And there was a Facebook page of floodies where people would build a kind of sense of virtual community and share information about, which contractors were honest, which recovery programs they had which experiences with, and so forth. Floody was a community, but it was a community of often highly anxious, stressed out, and alienated individuals, and that's something we want to talk about more as we get into the ethnographic portion. Floodies come of all different classes, races, backgrounds in Houston. Again, the Harvey especially spared few areas entirely. But that isn't to say that everyone experienced the storm the same way. The inequities, the grooves of racial disparity, of a governmental abandonment of the poor and marginalized and communities of color run deep in Houston, as they run deep in all cities in the United States. So we'll get into that a bit more later on. So I want to run through. There's no way to talk about all of the data. There's so much, but I wanted to pick one question that I thought was kind of exemplary of the main thrust of the project, which was asking people what factors were the most important in their decision about whether to relocate away from their residence that flooded or to stay. And this just gets at some of the themes. This was an open-ended question in the survey results. So here we have, without reading them, because you can do that yourself, I will just highlight some of the themes that I bolded in red. So this idea that people had a sense of community that they wanted to preserve was a reason why they stayed. They wanted to stay because of closeness to work, because of the investments they had made in their home, and as well as in the relationships they had built in their area. People often talked about their children. Sometimes I think it was an easy way to talk about their own pain was by talking about their children's pain. And that was something that came up in a lot. But this idea that, they had chosen the neighborhood, they had chosen where they lived to raise their children, and that they didn't want to move because of that was a theme that came up again, building on the relationships thematic I just discussed. Neighbors, neighborhood, convenience. In Meyerland, people talked a lot about the convenience of living near two highways, and what a beautiful, amazing thing it was that they could live in this place that was so beautiful and kind of green and verdant at the same time, that they could easily hop on an expressway and get to work in 10 minutes. Ownership in property investments was a big part of it, because that led also to the other side of this, which was the financial issues that people talked at great length about. I'd say, one person put it well and said, it's all about the finances, and it's also not about the finances at all. The finances are an easy way to talk about what we've lost. There's something concrete to hang on to. And so I think that, this idea of people being pushed to their financial limits through the flood process, through the quote-unquote recovery process that many of them doubted was really a recovery at all. This was the pivot that led to the decisions usually about when they had to move on. But the calculations were very personal for people about how much they could take. And some people felt, as this person did, that they just simply didn't have that choice. They had been robbed of the ability to choose their future because they were too underwater on their mortgage. The property value had plummeted. They couldn't sell. They couldn't rebuild properly either. We encountered some really tragic cases of people who were essentially living in one room, the one room they could afford to remediate of a home, and hoping that they'd be able to remediate the rest of it, but really living just outside of this very toxic black mold black mold compromised toxic space, and so that issue of feeling trapped was something people talked a lot about. They talked about guilt of the decision to live to want the home in the first place. The thing about Meyerland is the flooding has already depreciated homes, so there's a certain kind of home one could get in Meyerland that one couldn't get in other neighborhoods, and so people who were aspirational to live in a kind of mid-20th century cul-de-sac paradise could buy at great value these homes, and then they flood, and so they feel as though they had kind of compromised their family's future for a certain dream. And this idea of people feeling trapped and unsafe in their home was something we heard again and again. And frankly, one couldn't blame them for feeling that, having PTSD-like responses to hearing rainfall. There's one woman who put it in a very haunting way and said she just could hear the water lapping in her house, and what an uncanny sound that was to think about water in your home. So this idea that the compromise of the kind of infrastructures of home and shelter is being a key part of the emotional response is something that we can't get away from. And I think a great book is Vincent Adams' book on the post-Katrina response, The Markets of Sorrow. I mean, I think that book, if you wanted to read any book that kind of captures the affective landscape of what we found in this research really well, that would be one I'd recommend, a really fabulous work of critical political economy that also takes the affective emotional dimension of the post-flood experience very seriously. The stress, the feeling of being overwhelmed constantly. One person said it felt like a concussion. One person said it felt always trauma adjacent, this experience of recovery, again, that people doubted was really a recovery. So it gives you just some sense, a glimpse of some of the kinds of emotions that we heard. And we're calling these the major kind of affective dimension of this process, post-flood, slow catastrophe experience, diluvial individualism, which is not, there are ways in which it's kind of related to a classical liberal political subjectivity of, someone who's defining themselves in response, embrace of what's called negative freedom, a kind of response to corrupt and absent government or corporations or capitalism, a kind of freedom that's defined in opposition to those. But there's a woundedness to it too, that it's not just about the kind of the claim of private property and the defense of private property, but also this idea of abandonment, neglect, persecution even by government and sort of even civil society as a whole. So we heard so much about the failure of government. It really was probably next to stress and financial worries, probably the third largest theme. Everyone felt that the government had failed, not so much in the actual management of the catastrophic rainfall events themselves. People were very, very thankful and appreciative of what, say, first responders were able to provide, but rather this idea that the government was not helping them either to reattain a kind of pre-flood position, but also that there was no adequate long-term planning. And so there was a sense of kind of retreat into one's own, like, what could you do yourself? Like, we have to do something. Again, that's another part of liberal disposition, work, improvement, progress. Something has to be done. But really what people ended up doing when they had the resources to do is to try to create their own kind of private infrastructure, their own recovery process. And people said that this was kind of, they didn't want to do it. They wanted government to behave better. They wanted better planning, but they just were absolutely cynical about the possibilities of that happening, and doubtful of what politicians were saying, and just feeling like if you didn't flood, this was another person put it, people who haven't flooded don't understand. They don't understand how floodies think, how much they desire a certainty that is just never forthcoming, and how much they desire help, which is never adequate. So these are some of the kinds of personal infrastructure programs people did build. I mean, this is the Meyerland neighborhood, again, the wealthier of the two neighborhoods. And in the right-hand picture, you see a home that's been elevated about 5 feet. It's been put on hydraulic jacks, lifted into the air. We watched a couple of these happen. It's really remarkable as a kind of engineering feat. but also, it just, again, the preparation for it is usually a group of undocumented workers, persons of color themselves, tunneling under the house in a kind of weird, perverse take, sort of on the border imaginations of Texas, like burrowing under the house into the muck and creating placing the basis of the stilts upon which the house is going to be elevated. Like all of that labor goes into it alongside this engineering marvel. Anyway, the home gets raised into the air, you put it on stilts, and then you hide the stilts because there was a great fear of the aesthetics of the neighborhood changing from being these like mid-20th century ranch-style homes to something that quote-unquote looked as what people said derisively, a Galveston house. We can have a Galveston house here. But this is very expensive also. I mean, the house on the right probably cost somewhere between $175,000 and $250,000 to raise. The house on the left went a full 10 feet, so it could reclaim the space underneath for, it can't be living space, but it can be kind of entertaining space. And in this case, the people had a pool in the back, and they thought it'd be nice to have like a little kind of space to hang out by the pool. But to do that, to raise it a full 10 feet, requires still, greater levels of labor and engineering to pull it off. So that home elevation was over $300,000 to complete. So again, not for everybody. And the loan programs that exist from the government are minimal, and they take years to work through. So when we were doing field work in 2018, like a handful of elevation grants had been processed through FEMA, and they were from the 2015 flood. So it was like a 3-year backlog, and most people found that absolutely insane. And if they could, they went into their own pockets to pay for the elevations. So I want to pivot away from the diluvial individualism and talk a little bit more about the hydraulic citizenship we found. We're thinking of hydraulic citizenship as being another kind of affective publicity, another kind of affective orientation. And it's one that really focuses on, instead of a retreat out of the political sphere, an embrace of it, a kind of an attitude of trying to affect positive change by engaging the techno-political apparatus directly. And there's a long legacy of this in Houston. Houston flooded the first year of its existence. It flooded the next 2 years after that. It's had 180 major flood events in 182 years. So this goes back to this idea of Houston floods. But there have been some kind of key moments in the formation of hydraulic citizenship. And one, I'll just run through them quickly. One is, of course, the Great Hurricane of 1900 that destroyed Galveston as the major port in this part of the Gulf of Mexico. And that actually made Houston by default then into the new kind of port hub over the course of the 20th century. And so the modern Houston kind of wouldn't exist without hurricanes either. It certainly would have been more of a kind of a backwater that was built on the fruits of plantation slavery, especially sugar and cotton. Acquisition and processing. So U.S. Flood Control Act of 1917 began to expand the kind of national hydropolitics. But in Houston, the key moment in the early part of the 20th century was 1935's December floods, which totally destroyed Houston's downtown. And with the burgeoning use of the Houston Ship Channel corridor as the deepwater port for this region, as well as a center of military manufacturing, we begin to get the kind of the flood hydropolitical infrastructure begins to center around a kind of military industrial defense program. And that led the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to design and build the Addicks and Barker reservoirs upstream on the Buffalo Bayou between 1938 and 1946. Massive rainfall detention areas that people today are a little bit worried may no longer be up to the task. They may have they made it through Harvey, but there was a lot of fear about them giving way, and if one of them had given way, that would have again flooded a huge part of Houston's downtown, which already flooded substantially during Harvey. So just leave that aside there. National Flood Insurance Act of 1968 and the National Flood Insurance Program, which has been since Katrina technically bankrupt, but it continues to work on kind of year-to-year appropriations ever since. And it doesn't seem like it's going to go away, but it is a massive transfer of wealth from taxpayer revenue into people who choose to pursue what Adriana Petrina calls the diligent insanity possibility of rebuilding in floodplains. And there have been some high-profile cases of homes that have flooded 13 times and have received payments of millions and millions of dollars for a property that might be worth only a couple $100,000. So there is, as you can imagine, debates that are going on. I won't speak to them here about sort of the future of that program. For Harris County itself, though, the first floodplain maps were done in 1983, and that really began to then define certain parts of the city as being, for the first time, under certain kinds of market pressure if they were repetitively flooding. The Meyerland area has fought a pitched battle, which I'll discuss in the next couple of slides, to kind of defend its integrity as a neighborhood, in part by really throwing itself into Bayou level, Bayou watershed level infrastructural programs that will benefit them and preserve their property values. But this isn't true for most of the other bayous, and so you saw steep depreciation of land values in the floodplains beginning in the 1980s. Yes, okay, I'll skip over this part about Tropical Storm Allison. It's a little in the weeds if you don't know the urban design of Houston. So we came to focus, Mark and I, on the Brays Bayou Association as being what seemed to us the archetypical hydraulic citizens of Houston. This is the longest, most active civic organization that deals with flooding in the city. It's focused only, again, on one of the 22 watersheds, but it's a watershed that has a lot of wealth and a lot of property value along it. It formed in the early 1980s in response to flood events over the past several years. I've got a quote here from Charles Goforth, who's the president of the BBA, a very lively and interesting interlocutor for us. And again, they fit this definition that Anand makes of citizenship that emerges through continuous efforts to control, maintain, and manage the city's water. I want to say, though, that especially when the work we did in Greens Point, we found some incredibly brave, active political agents there too, folks who had taken it upon themselves to force their apartment complexes to remediate quickly, to give more information to prospective renters about flood risks. I mean, these are people who absolutely were also hydraulic citizens, even though they were fighting against those grooves of political neglect and abandonment, and also against racism, everyday racism, and dealing with the city and also with apartment complex owners in many cases. So, I don't want to take anything away from folks, those brave folks and the work they were doing. The focus on Brays Bayou is simply it's more of a kind of collective organization. It's kind of collective, kind of hydraulic citizenship. That's all I would say about that. And, just a little bit about the BBA, they focused early on subsidence was the big culprit. Pumping out groundwater had caused the whole city to lose several feet over its history of elevation. And of course, in areas where 6 inches this way or that means the difference between flooding or not, every inch, so to speak, counted. And so they fought successfully to have the Brays Bayou shifted over to lake water instead of groundwater. The water itself became quite a bit less appetizing in the process, but it was safer in terms of maintaining elevation. They've also really thrown their weight behind this Project Brays, which I'll talk about in the next couple of slides, which is a large ensemble of infrastructure projects that's been 20 years in the making to try to preserve the property values and mitigate the flood risks along the Brays Bayou. And so you'll see, though, in the Q&A on the right-hand column here, Goforth telling us that, he feels as though they keep hearing the same ideas, more upstream detention. Now they're talking a little bit about underground tunnels. What he'd like to see is more money in elevation grants, because he thinks that elevation grants, again, these personal infrastructure programs, are all that will really save people. He doesn't believe that enough money will ever be thrown at the general infrastructure projects, to the collective infrastructure projects to really remove homes from flood risk. He doesn't believe in retreat, getting people out of the floodplain. So I think, you've got to take it with a grain of salt, this hydraulic citizenship that ultimately kind of bends back on itself with this certain kind of diluvial individualist pose of, the whole purpose of our hydraulic citizenship is ultimately to leverage money to get personal elevation grants. So this is Brays Bayou, the Project Brays. And many millions have gone into this project, 450 million to be specific. It actually is not one project, but 75 projects. That's everything from channel widening to bridge modifications to new stormwater detention basins. Even as it's gone on, though, it seems as though it's kind of like one step forward, two steps back. The pace of the infrastructural development is being outpaced by the new rainfall intensities. So even though folks from the HCFCD told us, that's the Harris County Flood Control District, told us that they thought that Project Brays had actually saved some tens of thousands of homes from flooding in Hurricane Harvey, and I have no reason to doubt that those estimates are accurate. Still, the fact that so many new people who sort of out of the floodplain found themselves flooded suggests that, in fact, there's limits to what the infrastructural imagination can actually achieve. I want to show you a couple of images of what this Project Brays actually looks like. So this is a rechannelized bayou. This is a meeting of the Brays Bayou Association. As you see, it's mostly older folks, mostly white folks, mostly, and again, judging simply by the kinds of cars that were outside, mostly pretty well-to-do folks, a lot of Mercedes and so forth out there. Here, what some of the new bridges are looking like, and really, again, not to get in the weeds, but the reason why the bridges are a problem is because they create kind of bottlenecks for water evacuation. So they have to make them with these new very slim pillars in order to maximally evacuate water as fast as possible. The watershed engineering goes on. In 2019, we attended a meeting of the BBA where people talked about a new kind of Army Corps of Engineers project that would create a possibility of diverting through some kinds of new kind of interconnections. The Buffalo Bayou and the Brays Bayou, and this became a major point of contention at the BBA because people felt as though, again, Buffalo Bayou has always been the center of flood prevention, and that their Bayou watersheds interests were possibly being undermined, that they would, if push came to shove, rather send the floodwater out of Addicks and Barker into the Brays Bayou, where there's less at stake, less kind of industrial interests at stake and just simply homeowners, than they would, spend what it takes to really defend Brays. So, it was just interesting for us to see these political subjectivities coming into being around watersheds. And here, the latest, depending on how you look at it, Salvation or Boondoggle, they're talking about deep tunnels that could be dug underneath the bayou. And we had some really interesting conversations with the Harris County Flood Control about this, about whether deep tunnels, which are kind of had a certain charisma, had a certain kind of salvational promise attached to them in conversations we had in 2018, 2019, but actually are extraordinarily expensive, would cost hundreds of billions of dollars to equitably distribute across Harris County, at the same time that they might reduce flow in peak events by like 1% or 2%. So really just not really game changers. And yet people somehow were more interested in talking about the allure of these deep tunnels than they were about the idea of just retreating, just giving over certain areas of land back to the bayous. And that's sort of where I'd like to end the talk. A third kind of affective disposition, a third modality of affective publicity coming into being around amphibious acceptance. And this is just the idea that we have to, there's a limit to what hydropolitics can do, whether personal or collective, that in some ways we just have to accept that there will be more water here and that certain areas are not habitable. And so we're taking a cue here from anthropologist Kasper Bonjensen, who talks about the kind of the turn away from the terrestrial towards the amphibious as being the new kind of new mode of life in many coastal communities across the world. Obviously, many parts of the world already experienced that. And so we were looking at Navita Khan's work on the Chaura communities in Bangladesh, communities that literally have to adapt their ways of life to a constantly shifting alluvial floodplain. And that's not a mode of urbanism that someplace like Houston, which still very much is a petropolis, is a city invested in infrastructure and highways and concrete and petrochemical facilities, could even imagine, right? But I want to just shout out the Bayou Greenways 2020 initiative, which has been a really positive project the city and county have undertaken, along with a lot of private and corporate sponsorship, to create a system of walk and bike trails along the bayous that have, I think, really changed city life in some ways. They haven't done away with flooding, but they've brought people back into contact with the bayous that used to be kind of seen as simply a nuisance. And this idea of creating a new kind of positive affective attachment to bayou and riverine life in Houston is something that I think will be necessary as it contemplates its many potential forms of amphibious urbanism moving ahead. So that is a lot of data. It's a lot of thoughts to share. I'll stop there. I hope we'll have a chance to chat a little bit about this, and that we will somehow, somewhere have a chance to be in touch with each other in a more personal, upfront, close type of way.